I was standing frozen in the hallway when I heard my wife's laughter spill out of the kitchen. She looked me dead in the eye and said, "Paige is right. Maybe we should take a break." I just nodded, picked up my coat, and walked out the door. Heading straight to the private dinner her friend's husband had been begging my firm to arrange for 6 months. I heard them before I even got to the kitchen, Clara's laughter mixed with Paige's sharper one, bouncing off the walls of our house. The good wine I had been saving for our anniversary was already open on the counter, half empty. 2 glasses, both used. Paige was perched on the kitchen island like she owned the place, her designer heels tapping the cabinet below her. Spread out in front of her was one of Clara's wedding planning mood boards, photographs and color swatches, pinned and organized with the kind of precision Clara brought to everything she cared about. Paige was gesturing at it like she was running a boardroom meeting. "Honestly, Clara, your eye for this is genuinely stunning," she said, loud and easy. "Your brand should be on a completely different level by now. The aesthetic you've built is everything." She paused, letting her hand wave loosely toward the hallway. Toward my home office, toward me. "It's just that certain things hold people back." Dead weight. Clara saw me standing in the doorway right then. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She met my eyes the way you meet a stranger's. She set down her glass, looked at me evenly, and said it completely flat. "Paige is right. Maybe we should take a break." She said it the way you read a line off a page, already decided, already over. I stood there for a moment. Then I nodded once, pulled my coat off the hook by the door, and walked out. My name is Benjamin. For the last 7 years, I had worked as the Senior Acquisitions Director at Osprey Capital, one of the most aggressive private equity firms in the country. My job, in plain terms, was to decide the fate of struggling companies. I walked in, ran a full audit, and either authorized a buyout that gave them a future or recommended we let them collapse. In my world, my name carried weight. Clara had no idea. When we met, she asked what I did, and I said corporate finance. She heard something about data and analysis, and her eyes moved on. After that, she introduced me at parties as her husband, who was sort of in tech, kind of a mid-level data analyst. I never pushed back on that. My work required discretion. I had no interest in impressing the people Clara wanted to impress. Clara was a luxury wedding planner, talented, driven, and deeply attached to appearances. Her brand, her image, and the aesthetic of her life mattered to her in a way I had always respected, even when I didn't fully understand it. Paige had fed that attachment until it became something else entirely. Paige was the VP of Financial Operations at a tech startup called Zenith Tech, which her husband Grant had built from scratch. She had a wardrobe worth more than most people's yearly savings, and a very specific skill for making Clara feel like she was always one wrong decision away from falling behind. According to Paige, I was that wrong decision. The rain had started by the time I got to the car. I sat in the driveway for a moment, engine running, watching the drop streak down the windshield. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. A message from a number saved simply as G. Thornton, CEO. "Please tell me you're on your way. I can't afford for this to fall through." I put the car in reverse and pulled out. Grant Thornton was Paige's husband. He was also the founder of Zenith Tech, and for the last 8 months his company had been quietly dying. The runway was gone. Revenue targets had been missed twice in a row. The business sat on the edge of bankruptcy, and my firm had been watching it for weeks. Zenith had real assets buried under some very messy financial decisions. Solid software, a loyal client base, but the numbers were a disaster. We had a $40 million buyout on the table, conditional on the audit clearing. Grant didn't know that his wife was my wife's best friend. He knew me only as Mr. Benjamin, the quiet, serious man from Osprey Capital who held his company's future in both hands. I pulled up to the steakhouse 40 minutes later, handed my keys to the valet, and pushed through the heavy front door. The interior was warm and amber-lit, all dark wood and white linen. I found Grant at a corner table immediately. He was already there, sweating through his custom suit, both hands wrapped around a glass of water he hadn't touched. He stood the second he saw me. Grant's handshake was firm, his eyes were not. He was a man holding the weight of everything he had built, watching it start to slip. We sat down. The waiter brought menus. Neither of us opened them. Grant ordered the first thing he pointed to and started talking before the waiter had even walked away. He told me about Zenith, the way someone describes a person they love who is in serious trouble, with a kind of exhausted devotion and the honest admission that things had gotten out of control. The company had been genuinely innovative. The product was strong, but the financial operations had drifted far beyond what he could track himself. I lost control of the cash flow, he said, leaning forward. I trusted the wrong structure, but the core of what we built is still solid. I just need this acquisition to get us through. I listened. I asked calm, steady questions. I asked him to walk me through the outgoing vendor accounts and the payment structures. He reached into his leather portfolio and pulled out a thick stack of raw, unedited ledgers. The real numbers, not the cleaned-up version companies usually handed to auditors. He slid them across the white tablecloth toward me. "These are everything," he said. "I want this to be completely transparent." I opened the first page. He kept talking. I kept reading. Most of what I read was what I expected. Bloated software contracts, inflated operational costs, equipment purchases that made no sense for a company Zenith's size, standard mismanagement from a founder who was brilliant at building products and simply not built for financial oversight. Then I hit the vendor payments section. A consulting LLC appeared under recurring outgoing transfers. The amounts were significant. Large, structured wire payments, spaced out carefully enough to avoid triggering automatic fraud flags. Someone who understood financial systems had arranged this deliberately. I kept my face completely still. Under the table, I opened a quiet search on my phone and ran the LLC registration number. The results came back fast. The company was registered under a woman's maiden name. 3 seconds later, I had connected it. It was Paige's. I set the ledger down and picked up my water glass. Across the table, Grant was still talking. He was praising his VP of Finance for keeping the company functional during its worst period. He described her as the backbone of the operation. He said he trusted her completely. I watched him speak. A man who had handed control of his company's finances to his wife, who had then quietly and methodically drained it while using the proceeds to fund a lifestyle she weaponized against other women. The same summer home Clara had described to me once with hungry admiration had been bought with stolen pension funds. I turned to the next page and kept reading. I got back to the house at 2 a.m. The hallway was dark. The kitchen light was on, the small one above the stove that Clara always left burning when she wanted me to know she was still awake and waiting for something. I went upstairs. Clara was in bed, turned toward the wall. I stood in the doorway, looking at the shape of someone I had spent 7 years trying to understand. Then I went back downstairs and pulled my suitcase out of the hall closet. I packed in the dark. Work clothes, files, laptop, the things I actually needed. I left everything else exactly where it was. When I got to the kitchen, I set my wedding ring on the island, right next to the empty wine bottle she and Paige had finished that evening. Clara came downstairs just as I was zipping the bag. She had been awake. She had been listening through the door. She appeared at the bottom of the stairs with her arms folded and her expression composed, the posture of a woman waiting for the other person to crumble first. I didn't crumble. I picked up my bag, handed her the spare house key, and told her the mortgage was paid through the end of the month. Something shifted behind her eyes then. Not quite panic. Not yet. "Will you at least be at the gala on Friday?" she asked. I smiled. I wouldn't miss it. I checked into a hotel suite before sunrise. By the time the city was moving outside my window, I had 4 monitors running and 2 cups of coffee going cold on the desk beside me. Forensic audits move fast when you know exactly what you are looking for. I had already flagged the consulting LLC at dinner. Now I went deeper. I pulled every wire transfer connected to that account going back 30 months, cross-referencing each one against the fake vendor invoices Paige had filed to justify the payments. She had built a paper trail designed to look routine, and it would have to anyone not trained to spot this specific kind of internal fraud. I was built for exactly this. By mid-morning, I had mapped 3 separate streams of embezzlement. The designer bags and the cars were almost a footnote. The real damage was in the pension fund. Paige had drained a significant portion of Zenith Tech's employee retirement accounts, moved the money through 2 dummy holding companies, and used it as the down payment on the summer home that Clara had once described to me with barely concealed longing. I printed everything out and stacked it into a black folder. The dossier was complete. It was enough to open a full federal investigation. It was more than enough to send Paige to prison. I labeled the folder, set it on the desk, and closed my laptop. Now I just needed the right stage. I had my assistant confirm one detail on Thursday morning, that my keynote slot at the City Industry Gala on Friday was still on the program. It was. The City Industry Gala was the most important networking event of the year in our city. Every serious investor, every major executive, every person who cared about being in the right room at the right moment, they would all be there. Clara had been preparing for it for weeks. I knew because I had listened to her talk about table assignments and dress choices across 3 separate dinners like she was planning a military operation. What she didn't know was that I had been invited as the keynote speaker. A detail buried somewhere in all those boring corporate trips and data work conversations she had never thought to ask about. I had never volunteered it. There had never been a reason to. Friday afternoon, I put on my best suit and had the black folder sent ahead to the venue. Clara had spent the entire day posting on social media, photos of her and Paige getting ready together, champagne glasses raised, laughing at the camera. The captions talked about their bond, their aesthetic, their shared success. The comments were full of people telling them they looked incredible. Grant's text arrived as my car reached the venue. On my way, I have everything. I stepped out onto the pavement and walked through the front doors. The ballroom was exactly the kind of room designed to make people feel that everything outside it was smaller and less important. Crystal chandeliers overhead, long tables draped in white linen, a string quartet threading music through hundreds of quiet conversations, the ceiling impossibly high. The light warm and gold and flattering to everyone it touched. I was taken to the VIP balcony level, where the evening's speakers and senior partners were gathered before the program started. From up there, I had a clean view of the entire floor below. I found Clara and Paige within 2 minutes. They had positioned themselves at a prime center table, exactly where the most people would see them. Paige was in a floor-length gown, champagne in hand, commanding the table around her like it was a stage. Clara sat beside her, poised and composed, playing the part of a woman who had made a clean and confident decision. Neither of them looked up toward the balcony. Then Grant walked through the main doors. He moved differently than he had at the steakhouse, slower, heavier. His face had none of the anxious energy from our dinner. It had been replaced by something worse. Quiet resolve. He held a manila envelope gripped in his right hand. He scanned the room. He found his wife at the center table. He started walking toward her. I straightened my jacket, set down my water glass, and headed for the stairs. I timed it perfectly. I came down the staircase just as Grant reached the edge of their table. Paige was mid-sentence, one hand gesturing expressively, holding court the way she always did. Clara sat beside her, watching with that particular look of admiration she always tried to make seem casual. I crossed the ballroom floor. Steady pace, no urgency. Paige saw me first. Her eyes caught mine, and she smiled immediately. The practiced, slightly contemptuous smile she saved for people she felt comfortable dismissing. She leaned toward Clara and said something I couldn't hear. Clara's expression closed off. She looked away from me deliberately. I didn't stop at their table. I walked directly past it and came to stand beside Grant. Paige looked between us, visibly entertained. She assumed I had wandered over looking for something from her husband. "Grant," she said, tilting her head in my direction. "Why are you standing with Clara's ex? Is he begging you for a job?" A few people at nearby tables glanced over. Someone laughed quietly. Grant said nothing to that. He turned to Clara instead, met her eyes steadily, and said, "I don't think you know who your husband actually is." Clara blinked. The smile slipped off Paige's face for the first time that evening. Clara's eyes moved between Grant and me, trying to find the shape of what was happening. Paige crossed her arms. The champagne glass in her hand had gone completely still. Grant didn't hesitate. He gave my full name, my title, my firm. He told them that the man they had discussed over a shared bottle of wine, the man Clara had described to her friends as a mid-level data analyst, was the senior acquisitions director of Osprey Capital, the man who had just spent the past week conducting a full forensic audit of everything they had built their lives around. Paige's composure broke in pieces, not all at once, in stages, the way something comes apart under steady pressure. "You're lying," she said. She looked straight at me. "Ben just pushes paper. He doesn't have any real—" "You're right," I said. I let a full second pass. "I do push paper. Specifically, I push forensic audit reports regarding fraudulent vendor payments and drained employee pensions." The word pensions landed somewhere physical in the room. I watched the champagne glass begin to tremble in Paige's grip. Grant reached into the manila envelope and dropped the full stack of documents onto the center of their cocktail table. LLC registration records, wire transfer logs, summer home deeds. All of it fanned out across the white surface in front of them. Clara leaned forward slowly. Her voice had dropped very quiet. "Paige," she said, "what is this?" Paige stood completely still. She stared at the documents the way you stare at something when your brain has not yet agreed to process what your eyes are seeing. Her mouth opened twice. Both times, nothing came out. The woman who had spent years filling every silence in every room she entered had nothing left. She reached out and grabbed Grant's arm. "Keep your voice down," she whispered. Her eyes were scanning the tables around her. "We can deal with this privately. Not here. Not in front of everyone." Grant stepped back. One clear, deliberate step away from her. "You are officially terminated from Zenith Tech," he said. His voice was calm, completely calm. "Effective tonight. I am legally required to report the full scope of the embezzlement to the SEC as part of the acquisition agreement." He paused once. "You're going to prison, Paige." Clara made a sharp sound, barely audible over the noise of the ballroom, and took a physical step backward, away from the table. Away from Paige. Away from everything she had wrapped her identity around for years. I watched it all happen, the collapse of the whole performance. The aesthetic Paige had built so carefully, constructed on stolen money and well-placed contempt, coming apart in real time at the center of the most important social event of the year. People nearby had stopped pretending not to stare. The story was already in motion. There was no version of this she walked back from. Clara turned toward me. Her face cycled through several expressions quickly: confusion, shock, and then the unmistakable look of someone doing urgent arithmetic on 7 years they had badly miscalculated. Her eyes moved over me differently now, the way you look at something familiar that has suddenly revealed a shape you never bothered to look for. She was connecting all of it at once: the firm dinners, the travel, the calls I took in the hallway, the details she had filed away under boring or not worth asking about. She stepped away from the table and moved toward me. Her voice came out soft and deliberate. "Ben, my God, I had no idea." She reached out and placed her hand on my sleeve. "We need to go home and talk. This whole thing." Paige got inside my head and I lost sight of everything important. "Please." I looked down at her hand on my arm. Then I stepped out of her reach. Not dramatically, not with any performance. Just clearly. The way you move back from something that has already shown you exactly what it is and doesn't deserve a second chance to do it again. Clara's hand stayed suspended in the air for a moment before she slowly brought it down. I had loved this woman for 7 years. I had watched her drift, one dismissal at a time, toward a version of herself that had no room for me in it. She hadn't been dragged there. She had walked there, willingly, and she had done it while I was standing in the hallway listening. That kitchen moment had not been a mistake. It had been a conclusion. Clara's voice shifted. The careful softness cracked and something more urgent pushed through. "I made a terrible mistake," she said. "Paige manipulated me. You have to see that. She has been in my ear for years, making me feel like I was always falling behind, always making the wrong choices. I didn't understand what I was walking away from. Please, Ben, I want my husband back." She wasn't entirely wrong about the manipulation. Paige had been a quiet poison in our marriage for a long time. But Clara had also stood in our kitchen, looked me directly in the face, and delivered that line without flinching. That had not been Paige's doing in that moment. That had been Clara's. I looked at her steadily and said it plainly. "There is no we to talk about, Clara." Quote. She flinched like the words had weight. I glanced past her at Paige, who was hunched over the scattered documents, mascara tracking down her face, hands gripping the edge of the table. Then I looked back at Clara. "Paige told you to drop the dead weight so you could reach the next level," I said. "I just took her advice." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a white envelope. I handed it to Clara and told her it was straightforward. The divorce papers my legal team had prepared the morning after I walked out of our house. I added quietly that if she chose to contest them, my auditors would be glad to look more closely at her wedding planning business next. She took the envelope, found a pen at the bar, signed without another word. Other guests had been watching for a while by now. The quiet radius around our table had grown. People were no longer pretending to look elsewhere. Clara stood holding the signed papers with her arms stiff at her sides, blinking too fast. The social standing she had spent years building, the right events, the right tables, the right associations, the carefully managed aesthetic of her entire professional and personal life, was visibly crumbling around her in real time. What replaced it was something much simpler and far less flattering. A woman standing alone, beside evidence that her best friend had been a criminal and her husband had been someone she never bothered to actually know. "Please don't leave me alone with this," she said quietly. I had spent 7 years hoping she would ask me to stay. This was not that moment, and we both knew it. I handed her copy of the papers back to her gently, the way you hand something to someone who needs to hold it, whether they want to or not. Then I turned and walked toward the stage. Behind me, Paige was crying. The murmur of guests shifting in their chairs, already leaning toward the people beside them to piece together what had just happened, filled the space I left behind. Stories move through rooms like that one fast and without permission. I didn't look back once. Grant found me near the edge of the stage just before the program started. He looked like a man who had just set down something extremely heavy and was still adjusting to the absence of the weight. Relieved in a way that was still too raw and too close to feel clean yet. "Is the deal still on the table?" he asked. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the term sheet. My firm's partners had signed it the day before. I had been carrying it all evening. I held it out to him with a pen. "Zenith Tech is saved," I said. "But your wife's assets fold into the acquisition as partial compensation. Everything traceable to the embezzlement. The federal case moves forward separately. That part is out of our hands." Grant took the pen, he looked at the page for a moment, then signed it, clean and final. He handed it back and stood there quietly for a moment. "I trusted her completely," he said. "I know," I said. I folded the term sheet and slipped it back into my pocket. Some things don't need more response than that. The loss was real. The words existed. But the company he had built from nothing had a future again, saved by the same audit that had ended his marriage. That was the shape of it, and no amount of conversation was going to change it. I heard the host moving toward the podium behind me. I straightened my jacket and started walking. I walked to the stage without looking back at any of it. The host announced my name and title to the room. The applause was composed and genuine, the kind that comes from people who recognize exactly whose name they just heard. I stepped up to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out across the ballroom. I found their table without trying. Clara was standing beside it, the envelope still in her hands, watching the stage with an expression I had never seen on her face in 7 years. Paige was seated, head down, surrounded by the documents, and the careful, deliberate distance of guests who had quietly moved their chairs away. I delivered the keynote. The topic was one I had been asked to speak on months ago: corporate integrity and the dangers of internal rot. How companies fail, not from outside competition, but from the corrosion that starts quietly from within. How the most sophisticated fraud is almost always domestic and close. How the most damaging betrayals come from the people with keys to the building, access to the accounts, and the total trust of everyone who should have known better. I spoke clearly and without raising my voice. I looked at the room as a whole. When I finished, the applause was full and sustained. I stepped off the stage, shook 2 hands, and walked straight toward the exit. The ballroom noise faded behind me with every step, and by the time the cold night air hit my face, it felt like I had been holding my breath for a very long time and had finally, completely let go. The business press ran it cleanly on Monday. Osprey Capital's acquisition of Zenith Tech led 2 major financial publications. The coverage was straightforward: $40 million buyout, executive restructuring, company stabilized, and moving forward. But buried in the press release, picked up by every outlet that ran the story, was one additional detail: the termination and pending federal investigation of the VP of Financial Operations. By Tuesday afternoon, it had moved beyond business news. Federal agents moved on Paige's assets that morning. The cars went first, towed from the driveway with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggests they had been waiting for a signal. The designer items followed, boxed by agents, and loaded into a plain white van without ceremony. The summer home, the one Clara had described to me once with barely concealed longing, was seized before noon. I watched none of it directly. It reached me the way most things did, through people who knew what had happened and felt the need to pass it along. What I saw directly was Clara's social media feed by Wednesday morning. Her inbox had filled with cancellation notices. Clients who had booked her months in advance. People who ran in Paige's circles, who wanted no professional association with anyone connected to a federal fraud case. Her business, built so carefully on image and reputation and the right aesthetic, was bleeding out client by client. The structure Paige had helped Clara build around her life was coming apart the same way Paige's had. I went back to the house once, about a week later, to supervise the movers. Clara was sitting on the floor of the empty living room when I arrived. Her back was against the wall, legs stretched out in front of her, in the middle of a space that had been stripped of almost everything. She wasn't on her phone. She wasn't doing anything at all. She was just sitting in the particular silence a home makes when the life inside it is over. She looked up when I walked in. "I don't have anyone," she said. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't an argument. She said it the way someone reports a fact they have just finished processing. I checked in with the lead mover about the last boxes upstairs. When I came back through the living room, Clara was still on the floor. She tried one more time, reminded me of our wedding vows, of the 7 years, of the person she had been before Paige had gotten into her head. I listened. Then I crouched down and held out the finalized copy of the divorce decree. She took it with both hands and held it in her lap without looking at it. I stood, nodded to the mover, and picked up my bag. I walked to the front door. I opened it. The daylight outside was clean and unremarkable, just an ordinary afternoon in a city that was moving forward regardless. I stepped out. The door closed behind me. The firm's car was waiting at the curb. I put my bag in the back seat and got in. The driver looked at me in the mirror. "The office," I said. We pulled into traffic. I took out my phone. My assistant had sent a schedule update. 2 colleagues had left messages about a new acquisition target. There was a reminder about a board call Thursday morning. I moved through all of it with the easy focus of someone whose mind had come back to rest in the right place. I deleted Clara's number, then Paige's, which I had never gotten around to removing. I did it without ceremony, without pausing to feel anything particular about it. I put the phone in my pocket and looked out the window. The city moved past. Regular buildings, regular traffic, regular people going about the quiet work of their lives. I had spent 7 years being invisible inside my own marriage. I had let people who did not know me assign me a value based on a job title they had misunderstood and a lifestyle they had dismissed without interest. I had stayed quiet in kitchens and living rooms and dinner parties while women with stolen summer homes told my wife I was dead weight. Not one of them had known who they were talking to. Justice was served. The work was waiting. That had always been more than enough. I turned back to the window and let the city pass. You know, it is a strange thing. The people who are most certain about who you are tend to be the ones who know you the least. Paige thought her stolen money made her untouchable. Clara thought the aesthetic was more important than loyalty. Both of them looked at the same man every single day for 7 years and saw nothing worth keeping. But the boring reality they looked down on, the quiet work, the careful decisions made without any applause, that was the exact thing that took their entire fake world apart. Not because I planned it that way, just because that is what the truth does. Eventually, when you give it enough room. Have you ever had someone underestimate you, only to find out exactly who they were dealing with? Drop your best hidden power story in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this one hit close to home, smash that like button and subscribe, because karma doesn't just knock, it kicks the door down. I'll see you in the next one.